Hey friends, I hope you had a great Easter. Today we are going to be reading Queen of the Falls by Chris Van Allsburg. If you remember anything about Chris Van Allsburg, he wrote The Sweetest Fig, and he wrote the story about the crew of sailors who turned into monkeys after they found the wretched stone. So all of his have some kind of magic element. This is a unique one because this story actually happened. It's not magical, but it is very unique. So as we're reading today, I want you to be thinking about the character traits of Annie Edson, who is the main character. So as we're reading, I want you to be writing down some notes. What do you notice about her? How is she similar to a teacher that you've had? How is she different? What kind of character traits describe her? Imagine being as small as a flea, standing on a sidewalk next to an open fire hydrant. That's how visitors at the waterfalls at Niagara feel. The water drops from a height that is as tall as a 17-story building, roaring like a locomotive and sending up an endless cloud of mist as it crashes onto the rocks and water below. The earth at its base is practically shaking, terrifying and thrilling to everyone who goes there. A visitor to Niagara back in the year 1901 would have found towns built on both sides of the falls, with many hotels that held the trainloads of people that arrived each day. Tourists usually filled the sidewalks, restaurants, and horse-drawn carriages. However, midday on October 24th of that year, the streets and sidewalks were strangely deserted. On that cool autumn Monday, all of Niagara had gathered at the edge of the falls. There in the midst of the restless crowd of thousands waited impatiently. Suddenly voices shouted, "There it is!" Outstretched hands pointed to the crest of the cascading wall of water. For a fleeting moment, a large barrel was visible. Then it plunged over the falls, disappearing in a liquid avalanche. Many in the crowd cried out. Then all eyes were frozen on the churning water below. I wonder if they've never seen anything going across the waterfall before. That's interesting. Let's see. Why had so many people gathered to watch a barrel plunge over the waterfall? Wouldn't the tons of water pounding onto the rocks below have simply broken it to pieces? And yet, there they stood, watching and waiting, holding their breath, waiting, because they all knew the barrel was not empty. Think, that's going to be a tall waterfall. The barrel wasn't empty. I wonder what was inside. Bay City, Michigan was a logging town located 200 miles west of Niagara Falls. On its main street, tucked in between the shops and offices, was a charm school, a place where children of Bay City's finest families could learn the correct fork to use at dinner and the usefulness of handkerchiefs and how to properly dance the waltz. The school's owner and only teacher was a short, plump, fussy woman named Annie Edison Taylor. For many years, she had traveled around America, from Chattanooga to Charleston to San Antonio, offering classes in dance and fine art and fine manners. Finally, her travels led her to Bay City, where more than 100 children enrolled in her new school. But her success did not last. As Annie grew older, her classes grew smaller. She was forced to say goodbye to her final student and close the school. Sounds way different than the school we go to. This one teaches you all kinds of manners and how to dance and how to be a proper person. Sitting in the place she called home, a small room in a boarding house, Annie worried about her future. She had not saved very much money during her years of traveling and teaching. Now she was frightened she might end up in the poorhouse, an unhappy place where old people without money or family to care for them went to live their years. She thought about looking for ordinary work as a store clerk or a cleaning woman, but Annie could not picture herself standing behind counters selling candy to her former students or scrubbing the floors in their parents' home. She was too proud, and the pay she would earn was too little. What Annie needed was a plan, a way to strike it rich and put her money worries behind her for good. Days passed by, and the widow's small savings grew even smaller. Try as she might, Annie could not come up with an idea. Until one warm July evening, when she returned to her room with a newspaper. The front of the page carried a story about a large number of tourists visiting Niagara Falls that summer. Annie had visited the falls as a child and could remember clearly the thundering waters and crowds of people drawn to them. Holding her father's hand, she had been hypnotized by the sights and sound. Suddenly, like a cork popping from a champagne bottle, an idea came to her. She would find fame and fortune by doing something no one in the world had ever done before. Annie Taylor would go over Niagara Falls in a barrel. So she goes from being a teacher to wanting to go over a very huge waterfall in a barrel. What kind of character traits would describe her? What kind of person is she if this is something that she's thinking about doing? The next morning, filled with excitement, Annie began planning her ride. She knew no ordinary barrel would do. Something special was called for. Annie drew a picture of a barrel that would suit her needs. A barrel that would be incredibly strong and just the right size for its passenger. She took her drawing to a workshop where men built barrels, mostly for holding things such as pickles and beer. The foreman of the shop had never seen a barrel like the one Annie had drawn and asked what it was for. When she shared her plans to ride down the barrel over Niagara Falls, the man looked at Annie in disbelief. He handed the drawing back and informed her his shop would build no such thing. The idea was madness, he told her. If she wanted to kill herself, she'd have to do it on her own. Annie went back to her room and continued to dream about the fame and fortune that would be hers once she conquered the falls. She looked at her drawings and was certain she would be safe no matter how violent the ride. Three days later, Annie called on a barrel maker again and convinced him she was not crazy. If he built the barrel according to her design, the widow assured him she could survive the fall without injury. The foreman agreed to do it and put his three best men on the job. Annie worked alongside them, picking out each piece of the thick white oak they used. When their work was done, they had a barrel that was 4.5 feet high, with iron bands wrapped around it, and it weighed more than 160 pounds. The workmen agreed it was a very sturdy thing indeed. It might even go through the falls in one piece. That didn't mean, of course, that anyone inside would survive. Annie understood the problem. You can put an egg inside a can and drop it to the floor. The can may not be damaged, but it's a different story for the egg. That's why Annie made the barrel just big enough to hold herself and a large number of pillows. She also fastened the inside metal handles to grab onto, and a leather belt to strap herself in securely. As Annie put the finishing touches on the barrel, she began planning her trip. She needed a manager, someone to go to Niagara Falls ahead of her and stir up interest among the local newspaper reporters, and tell them about the amazing Lady Daredevil, who would be arriving soon to conquer the mighty falls. She hired Frank Russell, a Bay City man who worked at carnivals and fairs. When they first met, Frank Russell was surprised by Annie's appearance. She looked exactly like the aging charm school teacher that she was, and nothing at all like the death-defying daredevil she was determined to become. He asked if she wasn't too old for such a difficult and dangerous adventure. Even a much stronger and fitter person stood practically no chance of surviving what she proposed. Annie had already decided that the public would have greater interest in a daredevil more youthful than herself. So she told them that she was only 42, instantly erasing 20 years from her true age. Mr. Russell didn't really believe her, and he didn't think anyone else would either. He did believe, though, that she was determined to go over the falls, and was certain there was money to be made if by some miracle she'd managed to climb out of her barrel alive. He could then parade Annie across America, visiting lecture halls and theaters where people would pay to see the barrel and hear her tell her story. Both he and Annie could get rich. Frank Russell accepted her offer and set off to Niagara Falls to set the stage for her arrival. Getting newspapers to run stories about Annie was not the only thing her manager needed to do. He also had to hire someone who could put Annie and her barrel in the river above the falls. If Annie was to have any chance of surviving her trip, the barrel would have to be placed in the water exactly at the right spot. Fred Truesdale lived in a cottage on the river's bank not far from the falls and knew the river as well as any man. He had a sturdy boat and the muscles to row it through the river's swift and deadly currents. He agreed to set the barrel and its passenger into the river. When Annie and her barrel finally arrived at Niagara, Frank Russell made sure there were newspaper reporters at the train station. Because he had stretched the truth a good deal by describing Annie as a 42-year-old adventuress who climbed mountains and swam across frigid lakes, the reporters were expecting a different sort of woman from the one who stepped off the train. Many of them wondered if the promised trip over the falls was just some kind of hoax. The barrel might go over, but would it really carry Annie Taylor inside? She looked old enough to be someone's grandma and appeared to have spent considerably more time baking pies than climbing mountains. As Annie answered their questions directly and sincerely, the reporters began to think she might be telling the truth. Maybe this woman, as incredible and ridiculous as it seemed, would actually climb into her barrel and go where no man or woman had gone before. What do you think it means when it says, she looked old enough to be someone's grandmother and appeared to have spent considerably more time baking pies than climbing mountains? I wonder if people are going to believe that she'll actually do it. The reporters went back to their newspapers. The barrel was put on display in Niagara's largest hotel, and Annie went with Frank to the boarding house where he'd taken rooms for them. Frank Russell decided that Annie should wait 10 days before taking her plunge over the falls. This would allow for excitement and interest to build up in the public. As they read the newspaper stories about the fearless Miss Taylor and viewed her barrel in the hotel lobby. When the fateful day arrived, Annie and Frank took the carriage to the riverside cottage of Fred Truesdale, the boatman. Annie's barrel, delivered from the hotel, waited for her there, along with a number of reporters and a small crowd of curious onlookers. Much larger crowds had gathered downriver, around the falls, not sure if they would see a miracle that day or a tragedy. Fred Truesdale and his assistant, Billy Horan, put the barrel in Fred's boat. They helped Annie aboard, and as they rowed onto the river, the reporters and spectators cheered and called out, "Good luck, Miss Taylor!" She stood in the boat and waved. "I will not say goodbye," she told them, "for I know I will see you all shortly." Then Annie sat back and adjusted her long black skirt, smiling politely at Fred and Billy. So that's when I'm going to stop today. We'll read the rest of it tomorrow. But so far, I want you guys to think, what character traits described Annie? Do you think she's going to do it? Do you think she's going to be okay? I'm trying to leave you on a cliffhanger. So you need to open up your Google Slides and answer the questions for today. You can type them in onto the slide. And I will see y'all tomorrow with the rest of the story.